Hey everyone! In this video I'm going to give you a few pieces of advice when it comes to designing your own experiment. And these tips generally apply for almost every type of data collection whenever your research project involves, but particularly when it involves an experimental design. So whenever your research project involves some kind of data collection, whether it's observational or experimental, the first and one of the most important pieces of advice is to think carefully about the design and about the data collection and about how you analyze your data before you actually collect your data, right? Again, this holds for non-experimental data as well, but it's most important for experimental data. The idea here is that we want to kind of spend as much time as possible, like most of the thinking for the project and for like analyzing your data should be done before any of the data is being collected, because it oftentimes happens that if you run an experiment and then start analyzing the data, then and you haven't really thought through each and every step of how you're going to analyze it and what exactly the quantities of interest are and things like that, what exactly the hypotheses are. It happens more often than not that then all of a sudden you realize, oh, I really should have maybe collected this additional variable because it might be a moderator that kind of affects the treatment effects, or maybe you realize, oh, I should have controlled for this other variable, or maybe you realize, well, another type of outcome would have been helpful, and things like that, right? So this happens a lot after once you kind of start analyzing the data. And what is really helpful to kind of prevent that and to force yourself to think as deeply and think as deeply as possible about the underlying structure of the data that you want to collect and the hypothesis that you want to test and the analysis that you want to run, is to pre-register your design. The idea behind pre-registration is basically that you create a public record of the main features of your design, as well as the hypothesis and your kind of strategy to analyze to test your hypothesis, right? And that way and then ultimately, when it comes to collecting your data and running your analysis, all you have to do is follow the steps in your pre-registration. This has two large advantages. One advantage is, as I said, it kind of forces you to think about, all the little details that you might otherwise, only start thinking about once you have the data. But it also helps prevent something, or it helps prevent researchers to, after the fact, kind of dig through all the data that they collected, and then kind of selectively only reporting results that seem to be statistically significant, and things like that, right? So we haven't really talked about this in this class, but when you look at the replication crisis in psychology and beyond psychology, a lot of research, a lot of experimental research has been kind of called into question because it couldn't be replicated in subsequent studies, right? And one potential explanation is that researchers kind of collect data and then report results conditional on them being statistically significant. And as soon as you have a pattern like that, as soon as you have kind of a pattern where you can afterwards, go through this so-called garden of forking paths and find your model specification that ultimately, yields a significant result, that kind of jeopardizes the entire framework of how we evaluate whether the results are actually valid, right? So one way to guard against that and to make sure that we're really testing the hypothesis that we initially wanted to that we set out to test, and also to give other researchers confidence that our results are really robust, or at least they were kind of hypothesized before we collected the data, it is useful to create this public record, this pre-registration. And there are a couple of online platforms where you can register your designs, and maybe in one of our subsequent weeks before submitting your final project, I can talk a little bit more about pre-registration if that is interesting for you. But it's the important thing about pre-registration for me personally is that it's not only a check that is supposed to constrain you. You know, you can always deviate from your pre-registration, but it's one just an aspect of being transparent about how you kind of what your plan was before you started collecting your data. And then secondly, it really forces you to think deeply about your design and about your analysis. And it happened to me multiple times in my own work that I was designing an experiment and then writing a pre-registration and then realized, okay, something here is missing. I need to change something about the design or add additional variables or things like that, right? So it really is, it's not only something to check on other researchers, it's also helping you to kind of really do all the conceptual thinking before you actually collect the data, and that usually like improves designs significantly. The second piece of advice is this in the book. I think it was called the Armada strategy, which is any design, any experiment. No experiment is ever perfect, right? No experiment can always alleviate all concerns or questions or is free of any potential not confounding factors, but there are always kind of open questions that one specific design cannot answer regarding mechanisms and things like that, right? So the idea is here is, or the piece of advice is not think about trying to design the perfect experiment that answers all questions that you have related to a topic, but rather think about it as several small experiments that kind of each provide a little puzzle piece to tell the bigger story, right? So designing a series of experiments that reinforce each other, that all kind of look at one question from slightly different perspectives, is usually more powerful and more persuasive than just running one single experiment that's supposedly answering every single question related to your research project. Okay. Another the third little bit broader piece of advice is to create zero variable cost data, and the underlying reasoning here is that there are a lot of running experiments is costly and can be very costly depending on where you run them, how many respondents you want to have, and things like that, right? But there are different types of costs, right? There are kind of constant costs when it comes to infrastructure and things like that. And then there are variable costs. And these variable costs, the sources of variable costs are usually staff time, so people who have to kind of help conducting the experiment, as well as participant payments, so giving people money or incentives to actually participate in your experiment, right? And so these are cost factors that ultimately increase as you increase the scale of the experiment, as you increase the sample size or run the experiment for a longer period of time. If you have high variable costs, then the total cost of your experiment increases more and more. The more respondents you have, the longer you have to run the experiment, right? So the idea is to create the idea behind creating zero variable cost data or zero variable cost experiments are experiments that do not need staff, right? So that would be, for example, moving a lab experiment where you need people to be present and potentially, be there to talk to participants and guide them through the experiments. Instead, if you run the experiment online, there's no, additional, you can basically run the experiment while you sleep. And so like the process overall, it's it doesn't require immediate attention by staff, for example, right? So that's one way to reduce these variable costs, right? And the other part, to the extent that it's possible, you can reduce participant payments if you design an experiment in a way that is actually enjoyable to participants, right? So if participants are inherently motivated to participate in your experiment, then you get around the question of the issue of participant payments increasing the total cost of your experiments, right? And so in this framework, comparing fixed costs and variable costs of an experiment, of course, digital experiments, online experiments, have a higher startup costs in the sense that you need probably spend more resources on getting the infrastructure to work and things like that. Software licenses and all these things. But these costs, they don't scale up as you increase, for example, the number of observations or respondents in your experiments, right? So if you kind of look at the relationship between the cost of an experiment and the number of participants, what we can say broadly is that analog experiments, or these more traditional experiments which have higher variable costs, increase as you increase the number of participants, whereas digital experiments have higher kind of startup costs. But if you're able to minimize these variable costs by making your experimental design enjoyable so that people actually want to participate for free, and make it run completely like automatically without staff attention, then at scale with larger experiments, digital experiments will be cheaper in the long run. And one example that I thought was really interesting in the Bit by Bit book, which is part of the author's dissertation research, is the Music Lab experiment, which was conducted a little while ago. And the idea here, I mean, this is an example of such a zero variable cost experiment with high kind of startup costs. And of course, the researchers here were at Columbia University and had lots of resources, web designers and people who kind of were able to set up this website. But once you kind of were able to provide the infrastructure, then adding participants to these experiments didn't increase any costs, right? So the idea behind this experiment is to examine the effect of so basically examine success in markets like the music industry, and whether there's like a systematic component or whether there's just random luck, whether some song becomes successful or doesn't become successful, and specifically to examine the role of kind of social signaling in that context, right? So to what extent does social signaling, in the sense of other people are listening to these songs, create either a deterministic process where certain songs just become more successful, or just increase the luck, and it just happens to be the case that one song was picked up and the other one wasn't, and then and that determined the subsequent success, right? So the design of this experiment is quite interesting. Ultimately, this was a platform that enabled participants who signed up to download free songs by small unknown bands, and the idea was that they would be given a list of songs, something along these lines that we see here, and they could then listen to some of the songs and then rate them and download them if they wish. So the incentive for the respondents, of course, was to discover new music and then download it for free if they want to, right? So they could download the song if they want to. And so the idea here was to basically create different worlds or different treatment conditions One in which respondents basically just independently decided which songs they liked and which ones they didn't like, and then there was a social influence condition where they saw how many songs were downloaded by other people. Where so that was kind of the social influence, seeing what other people are listening to, and that was split up into 8 different worlds, where people kind of had the same songs but saw only within their world downloads from that group of people, right? So based on that, you can of course kind of compare the outcomes across different worlds to see to what extent this is kind of systematic filtering out some songs that are inherently better, or whether it's just random which songs become successful and which songs don't become successful. And note here that the interesting aspect also is that the unit of analysis is not the user who's logging into one of those worlds, but it's rather the aggregate outcome of kind of the ranking of the songs in each of those worlds, any given day, right? So the structure of the analysis is slightly different, right? So comparing kind of different treatment conditions, if we look at the less social influence condition here, we see some information. I hope this is you can read this, but if you download the slides are on Canvas, and you'll be able to see it there. The point is that here in the less social influence condition, the songs are not ranked by download counts, and they're kind of just in random order. And so there is some social cue, but it's less strong. Whereas here you have just one leaderboard, and you see songs at the beginning that is downloaded most times, and then in descending order, right? So the results were also interesting. I will upload the paper too on Canvas, and then you can give it a look. It's again not part of the required readings, but I think it's really, really interesting. The results here were that more social influence ultimately leads to more unpredictability, right? So it's, even if you have these social influence mechanisms, ultimately what it leads to is more variability in which songs become successful and which songs don't become successful. Yeah. And interestingly, you can predict failure to some extent, but predicting success is much harder, right? And yeah, I guess one aspect we can talk about here a little bit is to what extent to what extent this is kind of a zero variable cost experiment, or to what extent you can kind of design this as a zero variable cost experiment versus not. So one kind of feature to change could be, for example, whether the music is actually, or the music licensing from the licensing perspective, whether it's free music or not, or you have to pay for the actual downloads and the licensing, right? And so as soon as you have not free music, but maybe better known bands or whatever, where you actually have to pay for licenses, then this experiment would have had kind of a higher variable cost and would increase by participant size. But if you have free music where you don't have to pay for licensing, then it can be basically at zero variable cost. But the trade-off is, of course, to what extent this is still, the music is still enough of an incentive for people to actually participate in this type of experiment. Really quickly, there's another experiment that I want to mention, and I'll put this on Canvas as well, of another kind of type of experiment that is zero variable cost, and that was conducted, and it's one example of an we talked about audit studies, I think, in our last Q&A as well, and there are lots of examples of audit studies, and this was one example of an audit study in academia. The idea behind audit studies is that you send, kind of like the job interview example that we talked about, you send requests to multiple people, varying randomly, manipulating the characteristics of the sender. So different job applicants with different ethnic backgrounds, for example. And then the outcome is whether you receive a response or whether you get an interview and things like that. Right? So here in this experiment, the researchers looked at students that emailed faculty requesting for a meeting, and they compared different sociodemographic characteristics of the students, and they found evidence for this racial bias. But interestingly, and this is also relating back to our question of heterogeneity, going beyond simple experiments and exploring heterogeneity in treatment effects, what we're seeing here is that there is kind of a temporal dimension to this racial discrimination, which is there was not much of a difference with faculty responses for requests when the students requested immediate meetings, but when it came to requests for meetings at a later point in time, there was a much higher both response rate and acceptance rate for Caucasian male students as compared to any other sociodemographic, right? And so again, this is an interesting example of, on the one hand, exploring kind of heterogeneous, exploring different mechanisms and comparing different variations of this treatment. But of course, there's also a kind of a problem and an ethical issue related to that, and maybe we'll talk about that later in the ethics session as well, which is these audit studies, of course, ultimately take away faculty, like in this case, faculty time from actually responding to real student requests, right? That might not be that consequential, but there are other examples where as soon as these requests become there are too many of those requests, and they keep people from actually doing helpful work, then that's becoming an issue, right? And so so another important point related to that is that there's a kind of a differentiation between zero variable cost for you as a researcher, because this ultimately was just the whole project was just sending emails to students, to faculty, asking for meetings, so zero variable cost for you, but it's not necessarily zero variable cost for society, so to speak, because the faculty who are responding to those emails, of course, take time responding to that request, right? So increasing the number of observations also increases the costs overall, because people have to respond to those emails, right? So in some situations, this can be worth the cost can outweigh the benefits can outweigh the costs. But it's something to keep in mind that zero variable cost for you as a researcher doesn't necessarily imply that it's zero variable cost overall when it comes to the design as overall. The last part, and we kind of touched upon ethics a little bit, the last part that I want to emphasize here when it comes to advice for designing an experiment is to always take ethics into account as you design your experiments. And there are these 3 R's that are based on the Russell and Birch's book, The Principles of Human Experimental Techniques. And they kind of outline these 3 kind of goals or guidelines of how you should design your experiments. First, replace, which basically means replacing experiments wherever possible. Replace experiments with less invasive methods. Refine treatments to make them less harmful wherever possible. Think about, can you refine this treatment to make it slightly less harmful, or reduce the number of participants only, to the extent that the treatment can be harmful potentially, or can involve costs for the participants. Reduce the number of participants and only include as many as you really need to, right? And so to kind of like illustrate these points briefly in an example, we're going to look at Kramer et al. 2014, which is also discussed in the Bit by Bit book, and I'm gonna upload this paper on Canvas as well, so we can chat about it as well if you like. The title of this paper is Experimental Evidence of Massive Scale Emotional Contagion Through Social Network. And this paper actually received quite a bunch of attention in the media and quite a bunch of criticism as well. The underlying reason is that this was a study that basically manipulated people's Facebook feed, and the underlying question was to what extent kind of positive or negative, receiving positive or negative messages in your news feed influences people's kind of emotional state as well, right? And so what they show, and this is one figure from the experiment, what they basically show is in the experimental condition, what they did was they identified posts that contained negative terms or positive terms in two different conditions, and then they eliminated all those posts, right? And in the control condition, they also eliminated posts, but they eliminated random posts without any regard for their without regard for their sentiment, whether they were positive or negative, right? So basically, one group had all negative posts removed, and one group had all positive posts removed, and one group had, just the same number but random posts removed, essentially, right? And so here we see the difference between treatment and control for both negativity reduced and positivity reduced. And what we see is the outcome then is in the posts of those people in the treatment and control group, we're looking at the number of positive and negative emotion words generated by these people, right? So you're looking at subsequent posts after receiving, whatever information they see on those posts, right? And so you see kind of you see a significant difference in the number of positive and negative words for both conditions, right? So if you're in the negativity reduced condition as compared to the control, so this is now here compared to here, you see that there are more positive words in people's posts and fewer negative words. And if the positivity was reduced in your experimental condition, then the number of positive words in the treatment group is much smaller than in the control group, and the number of negative words in the treatment group is larger than in the control group, right? Now, there are a couple of problems, besides the ethical point, there are a couple of problems with this experimental design. The outcome measure, one question one could ask is to what extent, the number of positive and negative terms is actually a good measure of people's emotional state. So there's a question of kind of construct validity that might be problematic. There's also very little in the analysis regarding kind of heterogeneity of treatment effects, so we don't really know who's really impacted. And the other part is that these, if we look at these differences are, statistically significant, but if you look at the actual scale here, these are percent of positive versus negative words, so these effect sizes are actually incredibly small, right? So there's also a question of to what extent these are substantively interesting effects beyond this question of construct validity ultimately, right? But the bigger part, or the bigger problem with this study, was that people were quite upset about this experimental manipulation, because ultimately, it kind of when people didn't consent to being part of these studies, and ultimately it's kind of playing with people's emotions to some extent. And one big reason why people were upset was that the treatment was based on removing posts from their timeline, right? So one concern could be, well, what if there was something really important that I needed to see, and that was just removed from my timeline, right? So there were multiple reasons why people were upset with this story, rightfully so, to a certain extent, for sure. And that led the publisher, here, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, to publish an editorial expression of concern and correction. And in the paper that I'm going to upload, this editorial expression of concern will be included as well, so you can take a look at that as well. Now, what could the researchers have done differently, kind of thinking about our 3 Rs to kind of design better experiments? Well, the first R was replace. So here, kind of to analyze this question, obviously the better, less ethically concerning option would have been to use an observational analysis, use some natural experiment. There is variation in how positive or negative feeds are over time or across networks and things like that, right? So it's not obvious right from the start why it wasn't possible to do this using some, leveraging some natural experiment that varies the sentiment in the newsfeed, and look at changes based on that. The second R, refine. So that implied kind of refining the experimental treatment. And here I mentioned that the experiment, one of the reasons why the experiment was considered problematic was that posts were blocked and people were not able to see them in their newsfeed. They could still access them if they, looked at people's profiles, but they were essentially removed from the newsfeed, right? So one possible improvement could have been to, not just remove posts, but rather kind of boost posts and make them more visible rather than completely removing other posts, right? That would be a less harmful treatment, because it would have not implied kind of making some information unavailable for people in their newsfeed. And then reduce, another argument, and this is kind of related to this point that I made, that the effects are statistically significant, but they're ultimately quite small. And so the reason why they're still detectable is that the sample size is quite large, right? And the analysis that are being done are just based on a simple difference in means estimator, right? And so given the underlying data structure, it would have been very quite possible to for example, use some difference in difference design, which is much higher powered, which would have allowed you to ultimately identify the same sized effects with a much smaller sample size, thus affecting much fewer people, right? So going through this checklist of kind of replace, refine, reduce, just for this one example, already shows us multiple, pieces where we could have improved the design of this experiment. All right, just a quick summary. I talked about reducing the number of observations. In general, one should we, most kind of think or pay attention to reducing the number of participants, and this kind of came up in our discussion now. As soon as there is uncertainty about whether the experiment will cause harm, and as soon as participation is not voluntary, like in this Facebook study where people didn't provide consent to being in the study, as soon as any of these applies, we should definitely try to keep the number of participants as small as possible. But then, in general, these 3 Rs that I mentioned show that also these kind of, taking ethics into account is not only kind of an obligation, but it can also be an opportunity. It also can create, new research avenues. It helps us, develop more efficient methods than standard approaches, and it can also stimulate interesting research. For example, and we'll talk about this later in the semester, thinking about like differential privacy. There's a lot of research that kind of developed based on the understanding that there are privacy concerns with a lot of kind of big data research, data related research projects. And so there's research on how can we leverage these data while at the same time making it possible that these data are ultimately or keep privacy or satisfy privacy concerns, right? So it's not only a constraint; it's also an opportunity. Or these thinking about these aspects of ethics create opportunities for research. All right, this is all for this week. I'm looking forward to our Q&A session next Wednesday.